all for coming, especially on such a dreary evening. Good evening and welcome to Roosevelt House. I'm Jessica Neuwirth, Director of the Human Rights Program, and we are delighted to partner with the Department of Women and Gender Studies tonight for this event. We're celebrating the recent publication of a new book by Rupal Oza, Semiotics of Rape, Sexual Subjectivity and Violation in Rural India. Rupal is a member of our Human Rights faculty from the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and tonight she will be in conversation with Vasuki Desai, Professor of Practice in Human Rights and International Law at the NYU Gallatin School. In Semiotics of Rape, Rupal Oza looks at rape as a language of hierarchy and control. Her work is based on 3 years of empirical research in rural Haryana in northwest India, and in the book she examines a range of issues through the lens of rape cases, including control over land and labor, caste, gender, and justice. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and as I think you've already heard, Vasuki Desai has been delayed in the subway system. So Rupal is here. I want to welcome her, and what we're going to do, since they were going to be in dialogue, and the first question is, what is the book about? I'm going to ask. We know that Vasuki already knows what the book is about, so I'm just going to ask Rupal to tell you what the book is about, and we'll pick it up with Vasuki when she arrives. Thank you.
Okay, so, wow, this is loud. Thank you so much for coming. It's such a pleasure, and it's such an incredible and touching and warm and welcoming moment to see so many familiar faces from so many different parts of my life that who are here to celebrate with me. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for being, for those of you who know me well and those of you who don't, this is not my comfort zone. I don't like doing these things. People are just like, yeah, we know. But I'm very happy to be here because it does give me the opportunity to say thank you in public to people who have really captured my heart in ways that are both in my life, in chosen families, as part of work. Thank you. Thank you for being such an incredible support and such an incredible community. Thank you for building that with me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Books are made, have the fiction of having a single author. And so part of my thanks is about the fact that books are never written in isolation or just by one person. They're written in collectives. So thank you for the walks. Thank you for the walks. Thank you for the food. Thank you for community. Thank you for talking with me about it. Dina Siddiqui's work has been an influence. Ross Pachesky's work has been an influence. Sarah Chin, Alan Fry. So many people here have been parts of my life. Jen Kaburi, Chris Mitchell. Thank you all. Good friends of mine, Anju Kamath, Paula, who I've been friends with for so very, very, very long. So I thank you for helping me craft this book and this story, which was difficult in so many ways. So what is this book about? Perhaps the best way to talk about the book is, and Vasuki's question was going to be, what anticipated the book? And for some of you who know, part of the things that I've been concerned with, or things that have, as a friend of mine says, keeps me awake at night, is the relationship between gender, violence, and political economy, and the ways in which those function together. And this book is one iteration of other things that I've written about it. So how did this book come about? In some ways, the book came about after 2012, when a young physiotherapist woman traveling in Delhi with her male companion was raped and killed. That killing anticipated and led to a national uprising by hundreds of thousands and thousands of people who took to the streets and demanded a different outcome for women in India. But while that was incredible, and in some ways it compelled the Indian government to craft a different narrative, rather than one that says unruly women out on the streets should be at home and under the rule and protection of the patriarch, they had to really quickly reframe the narrative after the uprising, which caught them unanticipated, to one that was about India's daughter, and why is the daughter to be harmed, etc. But part of this book is also compelled by silences. And the silence is around the fact that Dalit or OBC or Muslim women or working class women who are subject to violence every day do not anticipate or do not project that same, do not have that kind of outpouring of grief that this young woman did, which is not to diminish that one should always speak in the loudest possible ways and organize in the loudest possible ways against violence against everybody. But the silences did speak loudly to the fact that certain kinds of people with certain kinds of caste or class narratives were deserving of an outrage while others were not. So in some ways, this book anticipates that. So what do I do in the book? I think one of the best ways to talk about what the book does is to read a story. So let me do that. I'll read a story. I first met Sanjay on a hot summer afternoon in 2016. His t-shirt was rolled up to his biceps, and a crude tattoo was barely visible from under his left sleeve. Sanjay was a shy, young Dalit man, around 20 years old, who in August 2015 was accused of kidnapping and raping Kavita, a Jat girl he knew from his school. Dalits are the formerly untouchable caste and take on the name Dalit after B.R. Ambedkar, which means broken people. Jats are the dominant agricultural caste in Haryana and own most of the land and wield significant power. He was out on bail when we met. A few weeks later, Sanjay was acquitted of both crimes by the special sessions judge. There is a long legal history in India of leniency towards men in rape cases. This case, however, was not an instance of this kind of corruption. Sanjay's case was different. He and Kavita were in a 2-year relationship and had decided to run away together to get married. However, Kavita was just shy of turning 18 and was therefore not legally recognized as an adult. When her family discovered her affair, they contacted the police, who apprehended the young couple while they were hiding in Mumbai and brought them back to the village. Sanjay and Kavita's story is not unusual. Affairs made public or those considered illicit for breaching boundaries of caste or class are often disciplined through a series of violent measures. Dominant castes and classes and the people and institutions invested in safeguarding their power often deploy the charge of rape in these cases to mobilize the power of the state, specifically its police and courts, into restoring and guarding those boundaries. The accusation is part of a structure of revenge and retribution by the dominant castes against the subordinate caste or class for going above their station. Kavita and Sanjay's families, their lawyers, the judge, the police were all aware that this was not a story of kidnapping and rape. And yet, they all played a role in the drama of filing a case and participating in the subsequent trial that unfolded. In this story of revenge, the state, in the form of the police and courts, collude in restoring boundaries of caste and class. But Sanjay's and Kavita's story is also about how the drama of revenge was interrupted by a judge who acquitted Sanjay. It is a story about love and defiance, and about how these forces grate against existing social mores. It is a story emblematic of changing social landscapes. Semiotics of Rape is about rape in rural Haryana, a small northwestern state in India. Rather than speculate about why rape occurs or attempt to explain its persistence, this book focuses on what a rape charge does. It's very hard to do this. So part of the story is about what a rape charge does, which is why the word semiotics is in the title. So it's about thinking about caste politics. It's about how does land sort of manifest itself. And one of the questions that I think Vasuki was going to prompt me to ask, was going to prompt me to answer, was about how is sort of the book structured? What is the story you tell, and how does it unfold in chapter after chapter? So that's what I'm going to go to next. So again, let me start with the story. I wrote the chapters of the book in the ways in which the story of rape unfolded in Haryana to me. I began this research at the end of March in 2016, right? So it's sort of spring in Delhi and Haryana. The heat of the summer is just sort of on the horizon. You can almost feel it in the sort of middle of the day. It's hot. And I go to meet a superintendent of police, an extremely high official in one of the districts. I am shepherded into his office. It is large with an imposing desk and a huge conference table. Air conditioners are blazing inside. And there's a couple of people standing around, and he's this large, imposing sort of Jat man. And I enter, and he looks at me sort of dismissively and says, "What are you doing, and what do you want to know?" So I said, "Well, I'm trying to understand rape in Haryana." And he says to me, sort of looking down his long nose, and he says, "Most of the rapes are false." And this story about the fact that and I heard multiple statistics, 70%, 90%, 30%, whatever. But most of the time, this story about the fact that most rape cases are false was I heard over and over and over again. And one of the things that I know that Vasuki and I talked about is that even though this story that I'm writing is so specific to rural Haryana, it's so specific in terms of the empirical research, it's very particular about the place it is, it nevertheless speaks to larger stories about the fact that women's credibility in questions about the harm that they have faced is often met with disbelief. If you are in New York, think about Colombia, if you are in Zimbabwe, or if you're in Paris, or if you're anywhere else on the planet. And that sense of the fact that this is one of the most often told tales was unsurprising to me, even as it gets anticipated and told over and over and over and over again. So from the superintendent of the police to the lowest sort of constable, or even attorneys, or even people in the village or elsewhere, I heard this story told all the time to me. So the first story I talk about is this one, in which the argument is most rape cases are false because the woman consented. She consented to the relationship and therefore is filing a rape case because she's the affair was discovered. She's trying to sort of manage reputational harm, etc., etc., etc. Hi, Vasuki. We're on to the second question. I know. We just went along. It's all good. It's all good. It's great. I'm just talking about the second question and the chapter on consent. And so the first chapter is on consent. And part of what I argue in that case is, again, through a story of a young woman I call Vinita, who gets into an affair with a young man called Pradeep. All names and places in the book are, of course, pseudonyms. Vinita is a Dalit woman. Pradeep is a Jat man. They get into a relationship for 5 years, right? And the affair is discovered by her sister when she is found unconscious in front of the house. The family quickly files a rape charge, and it ends in a compromise. And I'm going to talk about what compromise means, right? But what I argue in that chapter is about the fact that consent in this story is not meant to accord a person giving autonomy or the ability to give permission, right? It's about corruption. And so the story about consent that Vinita gives to Pradeep is illegible within villages or courts or other kinds of things. There is no recognizability to the fact that this young woman has the autonomous subjectivity to give permission and have the autonomy to have sexual autonomy for herself. So consent then becomes not about permission, but about corruption and about figuring out ways to bring the unruly woman back into the folds of domestic sexuality. Vinita and Pradeep's case very quickly end in a compromise. And the next chapter then is about compromise, because the second most frequent story I heard was about compromise. Compromise is an out-of-court settlement between two parties. Rape cases in India and elsewhere are criminal cases, and it's illegal to settle out of court, right? Because it undermines the law and the state's standing in these cases. Part of what I do in this case with the question of compromise is to think about what does compromise do, but it's also about following what activists and Dalit attorneys, as well as other human rights attorneys, were worried about, which is that for people in subordinate caste and class positions in rural Haryana, because of their subordination, they would very often be compelled to compromise. So Haryana is a rural state. 60% of it is rural. 80% of land is owned by Jats. 2% of land is owned by Dalits. Most Dalits and other subordinate caste work on the lands of Jats. If a Dalit woman has been harmed or has been raped or violated, the concern amongst activists was that they will be compelled to compromise precisely because of the structural position of subordination, because they work on Jat lands, right? So they'll be told not to work, but it's the question of livelihood. In this chapter on compromise, I follow 3 cases, but in particular follow the case of a young woman I call Komal, who is Dalit, who was allegedly gang raped by 2 Jat and 2 OBC men. Her case ended in a compromise after dragging on for 4 years, and many of us were concerned that she and her family were being compelled and forced to compromise. But when I met her and I asked her about the compromise, she said she wanted it to happen. She said she was happy that was happening. And it made me pause. And I wondered whether she was saying that because out of exhaustion, out of fear, about a million other things. And yet, in multiple conversations with her, she continued to reiterate that this is what she wanted. Her demeanor after the compromise was markedly changed. So in some ways, I thought about compromise and the different ways in which it unfolds in rural Haryana in the stories that I followed by following and thinking about the work of Indigenous scholar Audra Simpson and the ways in which she writes about refusal. And I look at these cases to try and work out, at times, the ways in which compromise may not necessarily be failure, but perhaps deliberate disengagement. Now, one of the ways in which compromise occurs, as I mentioned, is because of the disparity between the fact that somebody owns land and somebody doesn't. So the ability to coerce a subordinate caste or class of people to agree to a compromise is because somebody had the means of production, had access to land or resources. The story of land emerged over and over and over again in the stories I followed, sometimes directly. Sometimes it was a dispute over land that led to violence, that led to other kinds of things. Sometimes that story was much more tangential and sort of in the background, but nevertheless sort of undergrid the stories that were taking place. But land was persistent. It was persistently in the ways in which people structured their identities, their caste positions, their gender positions, all of it. It saturated everything that I was doing. In this chapter, I follow 3 cases, some of which were about how land featured directly in a dispute and others were not as direct. But in this chapter, I followed how gender and caste were closely imbricated. And it is in this chapter, finally, we understand why Komal's case ended the way it did. The book ends, or in its penultimate chapter, the book ends by sort of asking the question, if in most cases, rape cases are not believed or are met with skepticism and disbelief, when then are rape cases believed? Or when is it that rape cases have a degree of veracity? And I follow cases in which death occurs. And when death occurs, it is in those circumstances that rape cases were believed. In this chapter, I argue that rape cases were often accorded a degree of veracity. Here, I followed two cases, one of Sheetal and the other of Ladli. I also ask and follow about how women who survive rape are often referred to by the zombie metaphor of Zinda Lash, the living dead.
Thank you, Rupal. My apologies to you and to everyone else for having ended up landing here so late. And I hope you've already got a sense of how brilliant this book is, both in terms of how deeply situated it is, in terms of the specific stories that Rupal follows and the particular social milieus of those particular cases and that family, and how that itself is nested in many other layers of context of both rural Haryana, of the national context, of questions of land, of caste, of global economic contexts and the world systems, and it's sort of in that sense sort of a model of how to do something that is both deeply situated, but also as speaks to a whole range of other contexts, but also other theoretical debates. And I guess the next question that I wanted to ask was sort of goes in some sense to how you think about sexual subjectivity as interpolated through all of those things as you speak to, and you make this distinction in the book between sexual agency and sexual subjectivity. So if we could speak to that.
Okay, so the title and the subtitle of the book also has sexual subjectivity in it, and it's an argument I make, so if you'll forgive me, but I'll read from the book because as I make this argument, because I want to be careful with the words I use. I deliberately use the term sexual subjectivity rather than sexual agency. They're not the same. Sexual agency is evident in cases like Kavita's, in which women are compelled to file rape cases after their illicit affairs are discovered, pressured by the need to mitigate the effects of reputational harm, as well as in cases that are colloquially referred to as breach of promise to marry cases, in which women file rape charges against lovers who lure them with the commitment to enter into a matrimonial alliance only to later abandon them. These cases are not rape cases. They do not involve violation of bodily integrity, but they do demonstrate sexual agency by the women who enter these relationships. While these cases are certainly evidence of deception by men, some of whom are of dominant caste and class, who lure women into relationships with them, they also demonstrate particular kinds of sexual agency in that these women enter into these alliances even when they cannot be certain of the outcome of the relationship. However, by focusing on sexual subjectivity, my efforts pivot in a different direction. I pay attention to how women navigate their cases, what they have to say about the choices they make, and how they, at times, defy the abjection to which they are subject. By focusing on subjectivity, I examine what is possible to reclaim. I'll elaborate this by briefly again referring back to the case I talked about, the young woman, Komal, who was allegedly gang raped by 2 OBC and 2 Jat men. It ended in a compromise, an out-of-court settlement after dragging on for 4 years. Cases like this, involving gang rape and more critically, violence against lower caste individuals, are often marked by threats and coercion against victims and survivors, who are generally forced to settle out of court. Dalit attorneys and activists who had organized around Komal's case feared that the compromise happened because Komal's family was coerced by dominant caste men into settling. However, Komal insisted that the compromise was a just outcome. Her demeanor after the case ended demonstrated relief and a steadfast belief that the settlement was a fitting end. An inquiry into subjectivity in Komal's case allows me to ask, What did compromise allow her to recuperate? While the outcome of her case is contrary to more conventional notions of justice that seek a guilty verdict and accountability through incarceration, and while the outcome was disappointing for activists who wanted to see whoever raped and beat Komal be convicted for the crimes against her, what can we understand about Komal's own insistence that the outcome was a good one? What can we learn by taking her claim seriously and not dismissing it as merely a misguided or a simple product of fear and exhaustion? In explicating the difference between sexual agency and sexual subjectivity, I also seek to dislodge the idea that subjectivity in rape cases is only tied to the sexual encounter. In so doing, I ask, what can we discern about sexual subjectivity of the raped woman that escapes the flat and stultifying characterization of her as solely a broken, powerless victim or a sullied, disgraced woman? Or I might add, that refuses characterizing her as a strong, heroic survivor. Through my research, I found that raped women refused to remain confined by the sexual scripts about them. They crafted a subjectivity that continually ventured outside these narratives, frustrating attempts to congeal a single flattening story about them. In some of the cases I followed, the subjectivity of raped women was evident in the articulation of their will, or, as in Komal's case, in their insistence on an outcome contrary to more conventional notions of what justice looks like. The stories I followed revealed more complex subjectivities than what a victim-survivor frame allows for. I was able to discern them by looking closely at how subjectivity enables a more expansive understanding of subjection. I argue that the sequestering that the shame of rape anticipates bringing to women tainted by it is never quite complete.
Seems like that's a really useful and really. No, I was going to say that's intervention of shifting from sexual agency to sexual subjectivity as the focus is a really significant intervention within feminist scholarship in a whole range of contexts. But one of the people you speak to in discussing that is Saidiya Hartman, and in a sense, my next question was about how you link. You draw a lot on Black studies, Saidiya Hartman, Ruthie Gilmore, others, and you speak. In many ways, this book is also situated in feminist studies, of course, but also at the intersection of Black studies and Dalit studies in terms of the intellectual traditions you draw on. So if you could speak a little bit to how you say more about that intersection and how you grapple with the openings and tensions at that intersection, what's enabling and what's closed in that.
Thank you. So, you know, this sort of relationship or links between Black studies and Dalit studies is, of course, not new. You know, other scholars, Shailaja Payak, Tanmori Sundarajan, many others have made this connection excellently. It's also historic, right? I mean, there was the Dalit Panthers Party, and there's been connections between W.E.B. Du Bois and Ambedkar and so on. So it's a long historic one. But I think that one of the ways, I'll talk about Ruthie's work, which has been influential, as well as my use of Saidiya Hartman's work. And I draw on Ruthie's much quoted definition of race as the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And so while many of us have drawn on this excellent definition of race, one of the ways in which I thought about it in my own work in thinking about group-differentiated vulnerability was really to think about how different groups of people were differentiated and made vulnerable on the axis of caste and land access and gender constructions and gender structures, patriarchy, home, village, et cetera, And in anticipating the ways in which people are structurally made vulnerable, then the question then became is, how then does one understand how that vulnerability then made some subject to harm versus inoculated others from it? Saidiya Hartman's work allows me to then think about drawing from the question about who is vulnerable to harm and how certain groups of people are so proximate to particular kinds of harm, was about thinking about the question of will. Hartman writes, if the commonplace understanding of the will implies the power to control and determine our actions and identifies the expressive capacity of the self-possessed and intending subject, certainly this is far afield of the conditions or terms of action available to the enslaved. Yet, the notion of the will connotes more than simply the capacity to act and to do. Rather, it distinguishes the autonomous agent from the enslaved, the encumbered, and the constrained. And I think with Hartman's, what is profound about her is, and I'm quoting this from the chapter I write about in Consent, about Vinita's story. Now, of course, the conditions of the enslaved is incredibly different than those of people who are in Haryana. There is no sort of parallel or comparison. But I think what is important and significant about Hartman is that she's having us understand about the capacity of people to have will, even under conditions that are incredibly profoundly violent. And it is that capacity of will that I'm trying to understand. And the reason I want to understand about will is because will is about the capacity of an autonomous subject. And in some ways, when I'm thinking about consent and who has the capacity to give consent and the fact that that is illegible, it is about the illegibility of autonomy given to a subject. And that's why I draw on Hartman.
Great, thanks, Rupal. And that sort of goes to sort of my next question about the illegibility, because partly you're talking about it's illegible sometimes to the law, and that sometimes the very what you sort of anticipated already in your description of your different chapters, when it becomes visible to the law is at the moment of death. So I wondered whether you could sort of perhaps speak to about death and recognition, and draw particularly, I mean, you spoke already to Audrey Simpson, and perhaps that's the other tradition that you draw on, sort of indigenous studies, to think about recognition and refusal. So can you say a bit more about what you draw on in this field?
So Vasuki's question is anticipating part of what I do at the end of the book, which is about the two cases where I talk about when death occurs, right? It's the end of the book where I'm asking the question, what does death allow? And sort of the horror of that is about the fact of these two stories, one of Sheetal and the other of Ladli. So Sheetal is shy, incredibly charming young woman I met who loved to dance and was gang raped by 12 men, 8 of whom were finally caught, 4 were indicted. When the gang rape occurs, it was filmed on a cell phone camera. That video circulated in the village. She didn't tell her parents about the rape for about 9 days. When finally her parents found out, they were shocked and surprised. At that point, she was living with her grandparents in the city because she had exams coming up. She was in 12th grade. And the shock and horror of that tale sent her father back to the village. And when he got there, he found that the video of his daughter's rape was circulating. And he was so horrified by it that he consumed pesticide and died. Ladli's case is of another young woman in a different district who is OBC. OBC are other backward classes. It's a category by the government of India that is a list of other caste and class categories of people who are historically, socially, and educationally disenfranchised. Ladli is OBC. The 4 men who raped her were also OBC. And it happened when there was a wedding in the Basti, in the neighborhood. And her grandmother was looking for her. And she was looking for her because Ladli was sent out of the home to fill water in the communal tap. And the water was running, and the bucket was filled. And so the grandmother came out and was like, where the hell is she, and why isn't she brought the water back? And kept calling out to her and couldn't find her. Later in the evening, Ladli came back home and just lay down and went to sleep. And then woke up the next morning, and did not wake up the next morning, and her parents tried to rouse her. And finally, when she woke up, they found her clothes bloodstained, is when they found out. When they filed a case against these 4 men, their men and their families began a concerted effort of harassment and bullying to the family. In a few months, Ladli's body was discovered burnt, and she was profoundly injured and died a few weeks later. Both of these horrifying tales compelled further investigations, etc., etc. In this chapter, I say death forces recognition by courts of the harm done to Dalit and subordinate caste bodies. It cannot be ignored. As one of the lawyers said to me, the case has become serious. The significance of this is that the body is the site of evidence. Let me tell you about another case that just happened, only because it's literally in the news, not as much as, not here at all, but and not even that much in India. Some of you from the subcontinent might have heard of it. I write about the book in its preface and in the conclusion. In Hathras district in Uttar Pradesh, which is the neighboring town, neighboring state, large state, also agricultural, similar in terms of sort of agricultural makeup, etc. A young Dalit girl in 2020 was raped by 4 Thakur men. Thakur is the dominant caste in UP. The state, which is right-wing, as well as the police, colluded with the dominant caste men and at first refused to file the case. After much effort by activists and other people coming to Hathras, the case was finally lodged, and it actually went to the Central Bureau of Investigation. But what the police also did was cremate this young woman's body in the middle of the night, and without the consent of the family. So part of the reason that I'm trying to raise about death and about why is it that the dead body needs to disappear, literally has to be eliminated, is because the body bears evidence. And what it does is that it compels authorities of the state to pay attention, to grant recognition where the most usual response is to ignore, to defy, to say that it did not happen. What Dalit activists, as well as other people, often do with bodies, such as in Sheetal's case, is that they refuse to perform last rites and cremate the body unless an investigation takes place. There's a perverse logic, there's a perverse violence and logic to this strategy, which is worth noting. That it is often the finality of death that compels authorities to pay attention to those making a complaint and to follow the most basic of legal procedures. And it is this part of recognition and thinking about what is it that the body compels that I talk about. And in concluding the book, I dwell on the question of recognition and refusal by coming back to how I have been thinking about women's subjectivity. And let me read a bit from that part. I argue that the terms of recognition, the criteria that structures of power demand met in order to recognize subjects, are a suturing logic that bind together structures of power and the subjectivities they enable. So what do I mean by that? Let me explain. When the panchayat, panchayat is the village council, when the panchayat gets involved in a rape case in the village and deals with it as a social dispute, then the terms of recognizing or misrecognizing harm are guided by misogyny, caste power, efforts to control reputational damage sustained by the village, and a desire to not involve the courts. Consequently, panchayats diminish the harm done to the victim in the interest of facilitating reconciliation between the male heads of the families involved. For the young woman harmed, the lack of recognition of her injuries reinforces her diminished worth. In the village, the panchayat recognizes young women through relationships of paternalism, which is why reconciliation is often directed towards her father for her loss of value. So when Sheetal, the young woman that I talked about whose father killed himself, refuses, after Sheetal's case was lodged and it went to the courts and the police and they apprehended the 4 men, of course, very quickly, and this is sort of very, it's almost anticipated as part of the process of rape cases. Jat men and those that were in power, people in the panchayat, other people of power in the village, quickly came to her and her family to force her to compromise the case. One of the women, for example, that I heard of came to say, I will give you 6 kila, a demarcation of land area. I will give you 6 kila of zameen, of land, if you let my son go, right? So, which is why, as I said, I talk about land in the book because it's inescapable in some ways of the story. Sheetal refuses everything, including offers of money, including offers of coercion, etc., etc. She refuses. So when Sheetal refuses the efforts of her village elders and the panchayat to have her withdraw her complaint, what she calls for in her refusal is a renegotiation of the terms of recognition. In her refusal to withdraw her complaint, she exposes the terms by which village elders and panchayat constitute her subjectivity, and she demands a different outcome, one in which her injury is acknowledged. The consequences of Sheetal's refusal of the terms of recognition put forth by the village authorities generates a break with the village. She no longer resides in the village and has not returned to it since her assault. Her break with the village allows her to tentatively forge a different subjectivity that claims autonomy as a person deserving of restitution and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupal. And we have time for questions from the audience, right? So, yeah. So, over there.
When there's a compromise reached, does that then preclude any criminal matter going forward?
Thank you. That's a great question. One of the reasons why I really think about compromise not only anticipated as, oh my God, this is coercion, this is going to, make people not get justice, etc., is because sometimes, and this is again, I'm speaking from Dalit activists as well as feminist lawyers and others, when in the courts a woman is going against her own attorney and basically falsifies her testimony, it is sometimes the judges will charge her with false testimony and then will recriminalize her. So feminist lawyers have sort of said, you have to anticipate the fact that when women are compromising, there's a much more complex story behind it. And if we are not paying attention to that, and what sometimes would occur is that she gets charged with giving false testimony in courts. The other part of the story is sometimes compromise is also the only avenue intercaste relationships have from being charged with rape or with other kinds of things. So when there is an intercaste relationship and one of the families files a case, compromise becomes the way in which to get out of that false rape charge.
I have two questions. This was terrific, by the way. Thank you so. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much.
It's on.
Okay, great. So the first question is, can you give an example of what an actual compromise looks like? Like, what are the terms? What gets decided? Who gets what? And then I'm wondering, sort of in a more kind of meta-analytic way, how do you think your own caste and gender affected the way that your interviewees and your subjects interacted with you, or the police commissioner, or politicians, or activists, or lawyers? Because obviously you can't take that away. That goes with you everywhere you go.
Right. Thank you so much for asking that question. So how does a compromise look like? So a rape case is filed. That itself is a huge hurdle, right? If it gets filed, which is an FIR. An FIR is the first information report, right? An FIR gets filed or lodged. There's an investigation. The people are sometimes caught. Sometimes the investigation goes longer. They're brought in front of a magistrate, etc. Any of those things that happen will compel a compromise. So the accused family will come to the victim's family and say, here's money, here's this, here's that, and or saying you can no longer work in our lands, or whatever, or you are barred. There's a social boycott. So in this chapter on compromise, for example, I talk about social boycotts, which is that they just the Jats in the village will get together and boycott a family, and that way they will not have any access to making a living, right? Very often, the compromise involves only men. The women are never involved in it, right? The victim is certainly not part of it, and it's a agreement between men, right? And if it's about money, it's about sort of compensating the man for the loss of value of his daughter. Sometimes there is they write up things on what is called stamp paper. Stamp paper makes sense. It's a paper. It's an official document that is called a stamp paper. It doesn't really have a legal standing, because compromise is illegal. But they write up things in a stamp paper and make both parties sign it, and sometimes lawyers are present. The theatrics of it give it a certain kind of formality that makes it as if this is a done deal. It is always members of the panchayat and other people, officials of the village, that are always involved in the story of compromise. And it's always that case. It's never without that. To your second excellent question. My caste and class status is always, it's sort of on me, right? I would arrive, I was somebody who was from outside, living abroad, all of those things, right? It was always apparent. And there's so many stories I can tell you about the ways in which that functioned, right? I worried so much in doing this work that because I'm dominant caste and class, that it would force somebody to give and talk about their harm and the violence that had occurred to them because of who I was. And because I was so concerned about it, the only cases I followed were the ones that had already been part of feminist inquiry, right? Fact-finding reports or things that were part of organizing networks, things that were being brought by human rights organizations or lawyers or elsewhere fighting for justice for these people. I did not go find cases on my own, right? I only followed those. And therefore, through the avenues of the people who were investigating them, which profoundly circumscribed the cases I could follow, right? Which meant that they were predominantly OBC and Dalit cases. I asked over and over and over and over and over again about cases about dominant caste, all the time, everywhere I went. And the thing that was told to me over and over and over again was that, of course, women are raped. They're raped everywhere. They're raped by dominant caste and of dominant caste women, of course. But they're very quickly suppressed. and they are not, you cannot even talk to them. So if you remember the case of Kavita was dominant caste, right? And her relationship with Sanjay. And the lawyer for Kavita whom I met, I asked him, I said, can I talk to Kavita's father or members of the family or go to the village? And he did give me his number, but he did say, they're extremely traumatized and they don't want to talk about it. And so I respected their wishes and I didn't go and I couldn't find them, right? But the politics is complex, right? I mean, wherever I went, for example, if I went and met people who were dominant caste, of course I was given a certain kind of leeway, certain kinds of doors open to me, and certain kinds of things happened. I write in the preface of the book, or actually in the acknowledgements of the book, that people who I met without fail offered refreshment wherever I went. It's a cultural practice in South Asia. It just is. Everywhere you go, people will offer you endless amounts of tea, endless amounts of tea. And while that is a cultural practice, I'm also keenly aware that it's a cultural practice that was offered to me because of my caste position, right? It may not have been offered to people who I was with because of their caste position, right? So what does it mean for somebody who is dominant caste to write about this sort of work, right? So partly it is circumscribed, but partly it is about the fact that while I was working, it's about thinking about how does one participate and work and struggle with people to mitigate harm, no matter who they are and where they are from. So part of my understanding is coming from thinking about questions of solidarity. And that's where I think about some of this stuff, which is that solidarity, which I like more than allyship, to me is not so much a position. It's an agreement and a commitment to struggle with. That struggle is not going to be easy or without power or pure, and nor is it going to have lack of challenges or issues that are complex or any of those things. I anticipate those things. But I do want to think about how does one do this work with a degree of responsibility and care, even though I probably made a lot of mistakes. I also want to think about the fact that critiques that will come from this book and that I hope will be generative by comrades, friends, organizers, activists that occupy different positions of power may generate what Sarah Ahmed calls bad feelings, which she says, and I quote her, are creative responses to history's unfinished.
Paula?
Thank you, Rupal, and Vasuki for a great discussion and for your book, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I guess I had a question. Well, I had two questions. One was when you framed when the book began and when you started doing the research, it made me think about your process vis-a-vis another feminist transnational movement that happened around the same time, which is the Me Too movement. And I wondered about the intersection of the global Me Too movement, how Me Too manifested in India. And I just wondered about your thoughts on that. You know, what was the relationship? Because when you talked about the cell phone footage of the rape, of course you also have other kinds of mediated conversations happening in rural communities, you know, in new ways, especially among a younger generation of feminists across caste. And so I wondered about the circulation of different types of narratives about sexual subjectivity. So that was my first question. And the second question, again, I think connects to this issue of positionality. And you know, you've been such an important person in New York when it comes to feminist politics here and feminist pedagogy. And I just wonder a little bit about the way, so you talked about the theoretical framing of Black studies and Indigenous studies vis-a-vis this project, and I wondered a little bit how doing this project makes you think about these questions vis-a-vis debates here. You know, what are ways in which these stories, as you called them, shape the way that you think about some of the questions that you have broached vis-a-vis Black studies and Indigenous studies? You know, so it's trying to think about the traversal of ideas from there to here. So,
Thank you, Paula. So let me try and answer your first question. Words like Me Too have traffic and resonance in particular spaces, right? So for example, I write in the book about how some of the journalists in Bombay and elsewhere writing in the English language were invoking Me Too, right, in particular kinds of ways. I never heard that in rural Haryana. Nobody ever said Me Too, right? But to go to the question about cell phone footage and other kinds of things, I know because of your own sort of work as well. I was in a conversation with young women in a village one day, right? And I wanted to get their sense of what do they think about all of this stuff, right? And what they were talking about. And they were sort of both frustrated and sort of also angry about the fact that in so many ways, what has happened about this heightened attention around the assaults of women has made them stand on edge. Everything that they did, who they met, how much they talked on the cell phone, who did they text, etc., became spaces of intense scrutiny. I heard over and over and over again from all kinds of people that the reason why there is more rape cases is because of the cell phone. And I was like, okay, I don't know, but you know. But that was what they said. And for these young women, it was like, if I only speak on if I speak for a long time on the phone, and it could be anything, it could be completely innocent, that is an indictment or a way in which to think about the fact that they are somehow in an illicit affair, and that's who they're talking to. I heard from people, you know, parents and panchayat and other people say, if the girl only calls and says, okay, I'm on my way home and I should be back in, you know, whatever, in half an hour, that's okay. But if it went on longer than that, that was a problem. There was an issue, right? So for these young women, they were incredibly frustrated by the fact that what they wore, how they talked, who they met, and more women, young women, were going to college than ever before, right? And so because there were so many more young people in colleges, there were cafes, there were places that people would hang out. And I would hear from police officers from the Mahila Thanas, which is women's police stations, oh, you don't know about these women. They come to colleges, they don't tell their parents, they're hanging out at cafes. Cafes became this term that was sort of this den of illicit things, literally. I mean, like I heard the cafe multiple times. And so, you know, that's the way it functioned in terms of, I'm not sure. I think for your second question, I think perhaps I'll have to think about it more, and maybe you and I can have a conversation about how, you know, there is sort of resonance or tensions between the ways in which I'm using it here versus the ways in which the conversations are taking place here. The conversations here are complex and grounded in the kinds of structural and political realities of racial politics, as well as many people have said, right, the elimination of the native. But the ways in which Coulthard and Audra Simpson and others are really having us think about questions of recognition and refusal, you know, drawn themselves from Fanon and other post-colonial authors, is making me think about the way in which one can think about autonomy and subjectivity and will of the women and men who were in Haryana, and the ways in which they struggled to sort of capture that, right? I'll end with a quick story. One of the women I met, who was the mother of one of the women that was assaulted, was being compelled by an activist to say, you have to continue to fight, you have to continue to stay, you have to continue to stay in the struggle, don't leave, etc. And she said a couple of things, which I'll end with, which she said, and I'll say it in Hindi, in Haryanvi, and I'll translate. And she said, Bhains bandi hai gaam mein. I have tied my buffaloes in the village, right? And she said, this is the only place I have to go back to, right? And I think I had to think of when I heard that, to really think and register the fact that these are people with incredibly tenuous and vulnerable, as Ruthie Gilmore talks about it, right? Incredible vulnerability towards the ability to craft a living. To say that I have my buffaloes tied there was about saying and having us understand and think about the fact that that's the way they had to make a living. And the village was the only place they could go back to that they called home. However difficult and uncomfortable and complicated that return was, it nevertheless was something that one has to respect. And I think about that in some ways as a refusal. But it is because she's trying to craft her own autonomy and her sense of self. And I had to believe that.
Oh, Rupal, this is just gorgeous work. It's fantastic. I mean, one of the questions I had you just answered, which is where is the political economy piece? There it is. It's so, there's such humanism, I mean, in a good sense, in what you're doing. I love it. And so I'm going to ask a question that totally deflects from that, which is probably stupid, but I was fascinated, as you know, a political scientist to some extent. I was fascinated by your saying that compromise is illegal. So for me, I suddenly had this picture of these different layers of what we would call conflict resolution or whatever, negotiation. So you have the law, the court, and then you have this, but it's not exactly informal because it's done through various transactions and pieces of paper in the panchayat. And you know, so I just am interested in how you see the relationship between these different levels, or are they completely separate, or
well, you know, in
geography of it?
Yes, in some ways in our world, and in some ways relates somewhat to what Paula was also asking, right? The debates here about abolition have us think about the fact that compromise actually great. It allows for a non-carceral way of sort of adjudicating a horrible thing, right? And that is one way to think about it. But at the same time, compromises that occur in the village are about restoring patriarchal power. It's not an alternative, right? It's about saying the straying woman back into the libidinal folds of the patriarchal home and domestic space, right? They're not recognizing the fact that she's an autonomous subject. They're not recognizing her, and that's why saying fine, right? In fact, as Dina Siddiqui's work talks about it, there's an illegibility towards women having affairs, even though there was sort of a sort of tacit acceptance. But the moment it comes out into the public, the only way to talk about it is as rape. That's the only way to sort of signal it, right? Not another way. So while it is compelling, or you know, we want to think about it that way, I mean, it's complicated. Compromise is not about justice, right? It can do a certain kinds of things, but it's more complicated than that.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Oh, a whole bunch of questions. I think you had a question, you had a hand up, and the lady in red had a hand up, and then maybe the next round.
My question is really basic. Why Haryana?
Excellent question. It's not basic at all. Why Haryana? Oh dear, why Haryana? Haryana emerges, it's a small state, right? Haryana gets cleaved out of Punjab in 1966. It's a tiny state, mostly rural, etc. Haryana has emerged in the popular imagination in films, in stories, in newspaper articles as excessively patriarchal, as excessively somehow against women, right? Haryana has one of the poorest gender ratios, male to female, in the country, right? The activists and bureaucrats and other people I met often said, oh, nothing can happen in Haryana. It's sort of emerges as a place that's recalcitrant to change in some ways, right? But as a geographer,
particular story as well, or the film.
yes. So there is a story. Of course, I don't know if some of you have seen. There's a film about Haryana made by in Bollywood called NH10. NH10. And it's about one of the highways, and it's Anushka Sharma's in it, and blah blah blah. Right. And it's about this horrible tale, and the only way justice can happen in Haryana is through vengeance. That's the only way it can happen. Of course not. Right. As a geographer, I am invested and think closely about the ways in which people are fused to places and how to sort of dislodge that. And so part of this work is about saying, here are incredible stories about people who are against, breathtaking odds, crafting a subjectivity and sense of self. And I think justice ought to look at that and really believe their stories and not think that, in fact, places are recalcitrant to change. They're not. People fight all the time. Mahim.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, I want to say that I really like as a young South Asian person, it's really good to see that you gave a platform to like the vulnerable communities that we don't talk about often, like the Dalits. So I think, and as a student of political science, I really believe like politics is just inextricably linked to everything. So I think my question kind of relates to how the rise and spread of right-wing politics in India, how do you think that has some sort of an impact of how, minorities and in particular Dalits are treated in any case, and here specifically about in the context of rape? And also, I know you focus on rural India, but I was just wondering, how does the violation and the injustices that happen to the, women and minorities, how does this paint a picture of India in general, or just rural India and Haryana, as someone mentioned?
Such excellent questions. These are our amazing students. Everybody should be jealous of Hunter. Thank you for that question. Fantastic question. The answer to the first part is that is authoritarian right-wing India, is it worse for people who are minorities? The answer is yes. Yes, it's horrible. Yes, it's horrible. It's horrible for Dalits. It's horrible for Adivasis. It's horrible for Bahujan. It's horrible for Muslims. It's horrendous. And as many of us who are concerned and worried about it, right, we have to, both here and elsewhere, raise our voices and organize in the fiercest way possible to bring it down, period. Is it about India in general? I mean, when any of us who write this work, we constantly worry, particularly in circulations in the global north, about the ways in which this work gets understood. So I'm going to echo what I said earlier. Places and people are not fused. You cannot think about things, right? So even though I'm writing about this stuff, partly because I think these stories are telling us something that's important and significant to pay attention to. But I worry, of course. Right? I have no control over how this circulates. And the fact that people will be like, yet again, here's a place that is forever horrible to women, et cetera, et cetera. But I hope that the stories that I have said will dislodge that, in that they are stories also about resilience and about people who fight back and about will and about autonomy and about justice. And how does one think about those things? So I have no control over how it circulates, but I hope that's not what people will take away from it.
Thanks. Kind of related to the previous question, the conversation made me think about, love jihad and the specter of it, and the language of love jihad sort of invokes and obfuscates, I think, the agency of women, right, to make decisions, because there's this sense of, oh, well, you're being lured, and there's like a war that's being waged on the basis of sexuality to like control Hindu women, and the war is being waged by Muslim men. And I'm wondering if in your research you encountered this or found it led in the landscape that you were researching on, and if you could talk about that.
Thank you, Maham. That's a great question. Actually, I did not encounter that. It's love jihad is particularly prevalent in UP, right? That's where the narrative occurs, and it's also, in fact, it's now some sort of policy/law within Yogi Adityanath's government. Partly the reason I didn't encounter it because the Muslim population in Haryana is very, very low, right? And it's mostly in the north western part, and I wasn't really there. So it wasn't really a conversation that occurred. There aren't really the parts where I went to were that many Muslims. But as you rightly say, this is, it's entirely a fabricated kind of anxiety to yet again criminalize Muslims who inhabit the country and to make them alien as if somehow they're seducing Hindu women and so on and so forth. And it is about violence, right? And that's, I think, the way in which one should think about it. Thank you. So there's a reception upstairs where there are adult libations. But before you all go, I just want to say thank you, but thank you in particular to Katrina, Jessica, Joanne, and Catherine for making this event possible, and my deepest thanks to Vasuki for friendship and intellectual spaces. And thank you so much, all of you.
And buy the book, guys.